held to account. Mark Ward is one of the victims. He told Iain Dale on LBC that he accepts the apology.
I think it's come far, far too late. It does feel like they've said it now because they've had to say it rather than they really mean to say it. But it's an apology, and I do know some of the victims who that's all they ever really wanted was someone to say sorry.
The chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court is seeking arrest warrants for the Israeli Prime Minister and the leader of Hamas. Karim Khan says he has reasonable grounds to believe the men bear responsibility for war crimes. The High Court has ruled Julian Assange can appeal a decision to extradite him to the US. Judges believe assurances he won't face the death penalty aren't satisfactory. He's accused of spying after thousands of classified documents were leaked in 2010. The Environment Secretary's told MPs a number of confirmed cases of cryptosporidium in Devon could rise. Around 2,500 households in the Brixham area are continuing to boil their water after the parasite was found in supplies. In the city, the FTSE 100 has closed up 3 points at 84.24. The pound buy is $1.27 and €1.16. LBC weather showers for eastern England overnight, dry elsewhere, and a low of 2 degrees. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Daryl Jackson.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello, a very good evening. 2 minutes past 8 on LBC. Welcome to Monday's Cross Question. On the panel, sitting to my left, Dame Diana Johnson, Labour MP for Kingston upon Hull North. She chairs the Home Affairs Select Committee and is co-chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Haemophilia and Contaminated Blood. Sitting next to her is Tom Hunt, the Conservative MP for Ipswich. To my right is Gary Smith, General Secretary of the GMB Trade Union. And to everybody's right, Christian Calgie, who is Senior Political Correspondent for the Daily Express. They're here to answer your questions. 0345 6060 973 is the number to call, and we'd love you to watch us on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Right, let's go to our first question. It's from John in Stockport. Hello, John.
Good evening, Iain, and good evening to all your panel. I just want to ask a question and give you an analogy. If I've got a problem with my housing association, I can go to the ombudsman, who's totally independent, to adjudicate. What mechanisms can be put in place so that these miscarriages of justice and scandals, right, can be stopped, and people can stop saying they're going to learn from their lessons? So what mechanisms does the panel think could be put in place where it's not like the IPCC who investigate themselves, but what mechanism could be put in place to stop these from happening in the future?
And you're specifically referring, of course, to the contaminated blood scandal. Well, Diana Johnson, I'm very glad we've got you on tonight because you're an expert in this. You've been campaigning for many years on it. But before we sort of go into the wider implications here, what do you say to John?
Well, I think John makes a very important point, and one of the problems with the contaminated blood scandal was that for years and years government said there'd been no problem. In fact, they said that the victims had received the best treatment possible, and that as soon as it came to light there was a problem with hepatitis C in blood, they put the relevant tests in place. So they were saying everything was fine, and both those things were actual lies. So I think John makes a really important point about what do you do when government denies and the state denies there's a problem, and you've got 30-odd thousand people infected and 3,000 people dead. What do you do? And so one of the things Sir Brian in his report today has recommended is that Parliament itself, the select committees, ought to have a stronger role in being able to push ministers to hold public inquiries, because the only reason I think we've got the truth today is because we've had an independent former High Court judge looking at evidence for 6 years and finding out what the truth was. Now, it's taken decades to get to that point, but there has to be those checks and balances on an executive that refuses to accept they've done anything wrong.
There are so many analogies with the post office scandal here, aren't there, where you have people just in complete denial.
Yeah.
But I think it is different in the health service, isn't it? Because we like to think of medical professionals as just that, as professional, a caring profession. And yet they knew that the blood was contaminated and yet still kept importing it from the United States.
They did, yeah.
And it's very difficult for ordinary members of the public to then intervene and say, well, something must be done. And I suspect if you're a health minister, where even if you're told by a member of the general public that this is going on, you question senior people in the NHS and they come back, oh, so there's nothing to worry about, Minister. What do you do?
Well, you do, and that's a very important point. And another thing that Sir Brian says today is about the duty that has to be put on senior civil servants to ensure that proper information is put to ministers. One of the problems with the contaminated blood scandal was the Department of Health was institutionally defending itself. It was defensive throughout. And even when you had ministers asking questions, the civil servants tried to close that down. In fact, Sir Brian said it was like a scene from Yes Minister when the civil servants were saying, oh, this minister's asking her too many questions and he seems to be on the side of the victims. We've got to kind of sort this out. Yeah, we can't have that. We've told him what the position is. And clearly what they were saying to the minister was not correct. It wasn't the truth. So a duty of candour, whether the civil service code and the ministerial code are fit for purpose is another question that Sir Brian recommends that we look at as well.
Tom Hunt, I was saying that in the last hour, I remember when Jeremy Hunt became Health Secretary in 2012, one of the first things he did was make a speech. I think it was about, was it Shrewsbury and Telford Trust, where there'd been sort of a terrible scandal about maternity services. I think I've got that right, but apologies if I haven't. And he said that one of the things that he wished to be judged by was whether there were more whistleblowers in the NHS that could actually come forward and blow the whistle on things like this. 12 years on, I'm not sure anything has changed.
Well, I think there's just sadly too many examples. I mean, even at a local level, I'm thinking the number of constituents I've met with about the Norfolk and Suffolk Mental Health Trust, which has been in special measures now for over a decade. Nothing ever seems to change, and I've met with constituents whose loved ones would be with us now if they hadn't been let down so badly. And over the past decade, there's been various occasions where there's been that same sort of degree of evasiveness and institutional sort of protectionism. And I think it is a real worry. And I think there are some themes with the post office scandal as well. I mean, with regards to Jeremy Hunt, I mean, I know that he met with a constituent who was affected by this, I think in 2014. And I think he did do everything within his power to support. But I think this is almost a system problem. I think that, and I said earlier on, and I stand by it, the vast majority of people who work in the NHS are public-spirited, incredibly good people. But I just think that we do see these examples. The NHS is incredibly important to most of us, but that doesn't mean that it's beyond reproach. It doesn't mean that it's incapable of failings. And I think that when we see these multiple examples and these themes, I think we need to be prepared to do something about it. But clearly, I mean, Diana, the work that she's done on this is incredibly commendable. And I think actually today, and I think that it was quite a powerful moment, I think, in the chamber earlier. I think the Prime Minister spoke very well on this. And actually, I think the Leader of Opposition was also, matched the occasion as well. And I think that, cross-party, there's been failings here. There's more that could be done. And it has taken such a long time. And that, the inquiry in its findings was powerful. But again, the inquiry in and of itself took an incredibly long time. And there's people who aren't with us now who would have liked to have been alive to have seen this day.
Just very quickly, Diana, it seemed to me to be a very fulsome apology from the Prime Minister. Was there anything lacking that you would have liked him to say that he didn't?
Well, I thought it was a very good apology. However, his government has actually caused hurt to the community because last April, Sir Brian produced his final recommendations on compensation. The Prime Minister's government had already accepted the moral case for compensation to be paid. Sir Brian produced his recommendations in April. We're a year on, no money has been paid to anybody. Sir Brian said he was making those recommendations in April 23 because people were dying. They could not wait any longer. And sadly, the government again, and this has happened throughout the scandal, it's the delay that causes the hurt and the upset with people. So we're a year on. The compensation body is only being set up, actually, because Parliament last December, I tabled an amendment and we managed to defeat the government, who were whipping against Sir Brian's recommendation to set the body up. And Parliament, cross-party, we defeated the government to say, you have got to do this. So, I'm all for the Prime Minister and the Chancellor doing the right thing, but we need the action.
Well, the compensation scheme is going to be announced tomorrow, and I think they're saying payments will be made by October, aren't they?
I hope they do. If they say October, that would be absolutely great.
Well, I've heard that somewhere. I hope
that's right. Right.
Gary Smith.
The state is there to protect people, and the state not only failed people, but it put people in harm's way, and the inaction of the state, the cover-ups, people lost their lives. It's staggering, and I don't know what the solution is, but it can't simply be lengthy, hugely expensive public inquiries that seem to run on forever. Something has to give. This blood scandal is of a different magnitude, and I know some of the issues around both HIV and hepatitis, having grown up in Edinburgh in the 1980s, and I remember not only the harm that was done, but the stigma that was attached to these diseases. But, the blood scandal, Grenfell, Hillsborough, the post office, the list goes on, and we have to have a system where people feel as though they get listened to, and when there is wrongdoing, there is justice is delivered quickly. And in terms of workers in the NHS, hard-pressed people every day under the cosh at work, they need to have confidence that when they do raise issues, they're going to be listened to, they're going to be actioned, and they're not going to be victimised as a result of it. During the pandemic in Scotland, I can remember ambulance workers screaming out for the lack of PPE, and politicians believing that the PPE had been provided because it had been fed into the system, that the workers had all the protection that they needed, and it was nonsense. I don't know what the solution is, but something has to give.
Christian Calgie, do you think there is some media responsibility for the fact that this has taken so long to come about? Because the post office, everyone has natural sympathy with postmasters, sub-postmasters, sub-postmistresses. They see them every day. Whereas people who are victims here are people, many of whom have contracted AIDS because of it. They have hepatitis, and these are things that people find a bit yucky to talk about. And I think that is true in the media as well. I'm not blaming you personally.
Well, first of all, I would offer a spirited defence of the media overall. I think there's been some excellent media coverage, and the Sunday Times especially and other outlets have been waging just as impassioned campaign on this as Diana has. So, very often it's easy to make those sort of accusations, and there are always counter-examples. But I sort of I would agree with a general diagnosis, which is the media is sometimes, similar to politicians, it takes slightly too long for these things to catch on with the imagination. And again, I feel overall we were all rather guilty with the post office scandal of not taking it seriously until there was an ITV drama about it. And, actually, in that sense, rather similar to the general public overall, but I know we've got more of a responsibility to lead on these issues, and now it's obviously plastered on every front page, and we've been writing about it. We've been writing about it all day. So I don't know what more can be done, but there are obviously editorial decisions that sometimes, papers have to sell, right? And unfortunately, sometimes you've got to go down to the bottom line on this and think, if this issue hasn't yet caught the imagination, will us taking a lead on it bring it to the public imagination, or will it damage sales?
You are absolutely right to mention the Sunday Times, because Caroline Wheeler, who's now their political editor, she's been campaigning on this, I think, probably as long as you have, Diane.
A bit longer, actually, I think. But she was at the Hull Daily Mail for a while, so I got to know her then. And she knew my constituent who'd been infected.
She's done terribly well, hasn't she?
She's done very well, from the Hull Daily Mail onwards and upwards, yes.
Right, follow-up text question from Femi, who says the compensation for the infected blood scandal could end up costing £10 billion. There has to be another way, surely. It's a fair point, isn't it? But I can't think of one. Can any of you think of a different way of handling this?
No, and compensation has to be part of that apology, acknowledging that harm was done to people and that many have lost their lives, but many families have lost opportunities, the opportunity to have relationships, to marry, all of these things that need to be compensated for. And the fact that it's taken just so long to get to this point has meant the bill is so high. If we dealt with this 30 years ago, Sir Brian said at the end of the 80s we should have been thinking about a public inquiry and looking at what to do to compensate people. But it's taken so long, and that's why this bill is so high. But we cannot compensate people for harm that the state did to them and their families.
Should there be prosecutions as a result of this? Because I was told in the last hour by a caller that in France in 1999, 3 government ministers were prosecuted and one of them was sent to prison. Now, I'm not advocating that we should be prosecuting 85-year-old Ken Clarke or 83-year-old Norman Fowler, but I mean, there will be calls for somebody to take responsibility.
Well, I think today felt like, part one of a 2-act play, and we're getting the details on the 2 key issues from the report, one being the money and the other being the recommendations on accountability. Now, the Prime Minister today was a bit more emphatic about the money, but I did notice when reading back the words of the text that he was more effusive about what the government's response would be to Sir Brian's points on how to make people more accountable. And we've already spoken earlier about how there is always this attitude in the civil service, in public sector bodies, in quangos about protecting themselves and putting a barrier up. And I think I would be very supportive of moves to make that sector much more accountable, because I think it does often feel in scandals like this, and less scandalous but very important issues, that civil servants especially tend to get away with being moved to another department. There doesn't seem to be the accountability necessary. And of course we can chastise ministers for failing to probe, as we did with Sir Ed Davey at the Post Office, but at the end of the day they have gatekeepers that are very influential in what information they receive. And if they're making personal decisions about what that information is, they have to be held properly accountable and not just quietly moved to another department.
OK, we'll move on to another subject. It's been a very heavy news day today, so no shortage of subjects to talk about. It's 17 minutes past 8 on LBC.
This is LBC.
Pipe.
Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
8:20 on LBC. Labour MP Dame Diana Johnson is with us. Christian Calgie, senior political correspondent for the Daily Express. Gary Smith, General Secretary of the GMB Trade Union. And Tom Hunt, Conservative MP for Ipswich. Just before we move on, Diana, do you have a view on prosecutions on the contaminated blood scandal?
Yes, I think the evidence should be provided to the police. They should take a look at it, see if there is sufficient evidence to go to the CPS. Yes, absolutely. But the problem is, again, because it's taken so long, many of these people involved have either sadly died or are very elderly, and whether prosecutions will ever take place, I don't know. But I think the police should look at it.
In terms of NHS staff, in terms of civil servants, in terms of politicians?
Yeah, all three. And I also think particularly at Trelaws, which was the boarding school where young men, boys went to who had haemophilia, where they were experimented on. I mean, Sir Brian's very clear on that. They were experimented on. They weren't, the consent of parents was not given. That seems to me criminal activity there, criminal offences committed.
Tom?
I think one of the key things here is the lack of accountability, and it's very difficult to have accountability without some kind of consequence for those who have done wrong. So, yes, in principle, absolutely, I'd support it.
Gary?
Yeah, I think the principle is fine. I don't think in this case it's likely to happen, or it won't be on a scale that this whole scandal deserves. And I think that will probably require a change in the law, and this duty of candour and responsibility on people, I think, is an important one. But I do come back to as well, when people whistleblowing at work, they have to have confidence they're going to get the support and they're not going to be victimised for it.
There's a lot of interest in this, so I'm going to take another text question on it from Zach in Crystal Palace, who says famous inquiries in the US, even including the ones into the JFK assassination and whether Russia won Trump his election victory, are usually done within 2 years at the most. Why does it take this country so long to get to the truth? This report took ages, and it's now been nearly 7 years since Grenfell 2. Diana?
Well, what I would say about the contaminated blood scandal was it took place over many years in the 1970s and the 1980s in every part of the United Kingdom, Northern Ireland, Scotland, Wales, England. It involved many different hospitals. So I'm not surprised that it's taken 6 years to actually get to the point of the public inquiry reporting. I do agree, we wanted to do a thorough job, but obviously as quickly as possible. In the middle of this, we had COVID as well. But I do think in this case, it was probably always going to take a number of years just because of how huge this scandal is. I mean, Grenfell happened, it was one event on one day. Hillsborough was one event on one day. This was over several years, and I think that's sadly why it's taken so long.
Anybody else want to come in on this?
Well, I think we said earlier, this takes far too long. People need to feel confident that they're being listened to and that they can have access to justice, and it has to be done more quickly. Cover-ups cost lives, and they also cost the taxpayer a huge amount of money, and it's wrong on every single level.
Right, let's go to a different subject, very important subject. Moshe is in Salford. Good evening, what would you like to ask?
Good evening. I'm asking if now is the time that the UK leaves the ICC, or just compare today Benjamin Netanyahu to the Hamas leaders, which is just like comparing Churchill and Roosevelt to Adolf Hitler.
Well, the ICC's chief prosecutor, Karim Khan KC, who's British, has requested arrest warrants for Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Defence Minister Yoav Gallant, along with the Hamas leaders in Gaza, Yahya Sinwar, its political leader Ismail Haniyeh, and military chief Mohammed Deif. These warrants would need to be approved by ICC judges for them to take effect. And if that were to happen, any country which is signed up to the ICC would be obliged to arrest any of these 5 men if they step onto their soil. The UK is part of the ICC, but the United States, Russia and China are all not signed up to its charter. And of course, President Biden today described this decision by the ICC as outrageous. Christian, let's come to you first.
Well, I agree with Joe Biden, which is increasing rarity. I think it was offensive nonsense to draw parallels between a democratic state that remains in a bloody fight against evil terrorists that provoked conflict by murdering the largest number of Jews since the end of the Holocaust, comparing them to the terrorists that perpetrated that horrific crime is totally wrong. I don't understand why they've done it. It's completely discrediting. And I'd also draw parallels with their attitude to the other nonsense that we saw on the geopolitical world stage today, where we had our UN representative and all the others standing for a minute's silence to mourn the death of an evil president of Iran. And I'm very glad that the UK government took a solidly different approach to the European government that paid commiserations. But I don't know what's going on with international diplomacy at the moment. It seems they've all lost their heads somewhat.
Gary?
First of all, I visited Israel last year and I visited the West Bank. I was there on my own steam. I was visited on holiday, and it was a fascinating visit. I came home a week before the terrible Hamas attack. And I don't know about the legalities and the technicalities around the ICC, but I would say this. We should absolutely condemn what Hamas did. There is what the crimes they perpetrated against women, children and peaceful civilians. It's disgusting what happened. But likewise, we also have to recognise that the criticisms, the legitimate criticisms of the way the war is being prosecuted in Gaza. Thousands of innocent people have been killed, and I think there are very serious questions about the strategy of the Israeli state, and we should not be...
But do you believe civilians have been targeted? Because civilians always lose their lives in wars. That's not to justify it, but it is just a fact that it does happen. But the allegation here seems to be that Israel has deliberately targeted civilians.
I've not seen the story, so I don't want to comment on the detail of the story. But I think the way in which Israel is prosecuting the war has been condemned and criticised by Biden and others in the regime, in the government in the States. It has been across the political spectrum, I think, now in the UK. And we need to recognise that the manner in which people are being killed in Gaza, the starvation of people in Gaza, and what is going on is doing huge damage to Israel as well. And having visited Israel and the West Bank, what I'm very clear about is that if the Palestinian people are not afforded dignity, there is not going to be the peace that people across Israel and all the communities in Israel deserve.
Tom Hunt.
I think it was shocking what came out today. I mean, this ICC verdict, it wasn't just sort of being critical of the Israeli government. It wasn't saying that, we could have done this differently to have avoided the death of innocent lives. It drew a direct equivalence between the leaders of a democratic state who people might argue haven't done the best job in carrying out the response. I mean, they could make lots of points there, but an equivalence with a group of terrorists who have very, very deliberately targeted the most vulnerable within another country, with Israel, children, the elderly people. They brutalised and tortured and butchered. We've had dead babies and toddlers with their fingers cut off so they can be taken back as souvenirs. And I think to draw an equivalence between those two things, I think, is shocking beyond belief. That isn't to say that I don't think that, if people feel strongly that the Israeli government could be doing things differently, but it is a war. And unless you're a pacifist, one recognises that sometimes wars regretfully need to happen. I also think it's really important we get the right data, when it comes. I mean, any loss of life is utterly depressing and it's regretful. But at the moment, a number of times I've been hearing figures being branded out by MPs, and these are figures released by the Hamas-run health authority. Over the weekend, we had very different data coming out. And I'm not being glib saying, it was just this. It's utterly depressing however many people die, innocent civilians. We need to get our facts right. And it does seem as though some people are holding Israel to a far higher standard than any other democratic. I was in Israel in January. I went to a kibbutz where this massacre happened. And I'd been to the same kibbutz 4 years ago. And I found out that the head teacher of the kibbutz, who I'd sat next to at lunch 4 years ago, was burnt alive in a house. And I guess for me, it does, that did shape my thinking, that visit, perhaps more than any other.
Shouldn't we hold democratic states to a higher account than terrorist organisations? I mean, it's a reasonable thing to do, isn't it?
Well, I think it seems often that Israel's being held to a higher standard than other democratic nations or other, but ultimately, I think there's a world of difference between playing with devil's advocate, attacking the Israeli government because you feel as though they haven't taken steps that could have minimised civilian deaths, to a terrorist outfit who have deliberately got pleasure out of evil. It's certainly the closest to evil I've ever been, going to that Kibbutz and seeing what I saw. And I just think it raises real questions about the ICC. Obviously, the US aren't a member of it. I agree with Christian. What President Biden said is absolutely bang on. And I've been having concerns about President Biden, going a bit, not being supportive enough of Israel. But then he said what he said today.
Okay. Diana.
Well, I want to preface this by saying that I absolutely condemn what Hamas did. Absolutely. And I absolutely support that Israel has the right to defend itself. However, that has to be within international law. And I also think that we see the International Criminal Court as an important cornerstone of the legal framework that, as a country, we respect and operate within. What's been, as I understand it, what's actually been called for is the arrest warrant.
Yes.
So we're not saying this is a conviction. We're not saying this is a verdict on anything. We are saying, or the International Criminal Court are saying, that they want to have these arrest warrants. They are independent, and obviously they have to look at evidence and they have to form a view about whether that warrants an arrest warrant being issued. So that's kind of my view about this. You will excuse me for saying that I've spent most of the day in the infected blood inquiry, so I'm not so over this, but I do think that an arrest warrant is very different from actually the court making a finding or convicting.
Well, we're going to be talking about this in the 9 o'clock hour on the programme, so I'll welcome your views. I suspect we'll get some fairly trenchant views from both sides on this after 9. And we've got half an hour of questions to go on Cross Question. It's 8:32. Let's get the news headlines on LBC with Daryl Jackson.
A victim of the infected blood scandal has told LBC he welcomes the Prime Minister's apology following the findings of a public inquiry. Rishi Sunak says today is a day of shame for the British state after it concluded successive governments and the NHS were involved in a cover-up. The US president has condemned the International Criminal Court for seeking the arrest of Israeli leaders over the war in Gaza. Joe Biden says the decision to pursue them for crimes against humanity is outrageous. And Julian Assange's wife has told LBC the case against him should be abandoned and he should be compensated. The High Court's ruled he can appeal his extradition to the UK, where he's wanted on spying charges. LBC weather showers for eastern England overnight, dry elsewhere and a low of 2 degrees.
This is LBC.
ways.
Leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Alexa, send a comment to LBC.
8:35 on LBC. We have Dame Diana Johnson with us, Labour MP, Tom Hunt, Conservative MP, Christian Calgie, he's from the Daily Express, and Gary Smith is from the GMB. He's General Secretary of it. Why do you call yourself General Secretary? I mean, it sounds a bit communist.
Just inherited it. Just inherited.
Right, let's go to Chris in Stubbington. Hello, Chris.
Hello, Ian. Should water company bosses go to prison for dumping sewage in rivers and sea, as fines don't seem to be enough of a deterrent?
OK, so should water company bosses go to prison? As a lot of people want to send people to prison today on this programme for dumping sewage into the sea, as the fines do not seem to be enough of a deterrent for them. Tom?
I think it have to be a case-by-case basis. I mean, but I definitely think there should be a consequence for our actions. And if the consequences aren't great enough at the moment, we have to look into it. But I think sending somebody to prison is a incredibly serious.
You actually do have to have broken a law.
Yeah,
I mean, in cases like this, we can all think it's disgusting and terrible what's going on, but what law has been broken?
Well, I mean, I think for many, many years, this has been an issue. I think that, we brought in legislation to help tackle it. Some might argue that it could have gone further than it has. It is something that concerns me. It is something that should concern us. Clearly, our environment is, and I think the way that water companies operate more generally, I do think needs to be looked at further. And I think some of the things we've heard recently about some of the profits they've been making and shareholder profits, etc., need to be looked at as well. But I think prison is obviously a pretty robust thing,
particularly when we have no prison places. Gary Smith.
Tom, this is happening on your party's watch. You've been in power for a long time, and the position in terms of filth on our beaches and our rivers is getting worse. You have stood by and watched all the financial engineering and the asset stripping that has gone on in the sector. So, it's not about we've not gone far enough. You have absolutely failed the people in this country in terms of making sure our beaches and rivers are clean and that people have got a decent water and sewage system. We can, do we throw people in jail? Maybe there is very serious breaches of health and safety legislation, environmental legislation. This has real serious consequences for our communities. But actually what we've got to address is a failing and failed system. We know the regulatory system overseen by Ofwat has been failing for a long time. We have stood by and watched companies like Macquarie's leave companies like Thames Water on their knees. We have watched all this financial engineering and people pocketing millions while we've got excrement on our beaches. So we need to have a debate and a proper discussion about how we are going to structure our key utilities going forward in order that we can have clean beaches, we can have clean rivers, and that people in the country can feel safe. Because what's going to happen now is these water companies that are overseeing this scandal are looking for huge increases in customer bills to offset years of failure and years of financial engineering where some people filled their pockets at the expense of us all.
What do you think a future Labour government should do about this?
They're going to have a debate about water and our utilities more widely. We have a problem that we've never addressed in the country, that you're also going to have more water stress in places like the southeast. Incredibly, since privatisation, we've actually closed reservoirs, we built on them, we sold off the land, we built executive housing, people made a fortune out of it. But how are you going to address the issues about water stress in times of climate change? As the climate gets warmer, how are we going to get water to the areas that need it most? There's going to have to be a different solution, and there's going to also have to be an honest conversation about how we're going to get the investment that we need. I don't think the people in this country, though, are going to stand for 30, 40, 56% increase in water bills, because that's what's been talked about over the next few years. I don't think people are going to stand for that, and therefore I think it is going to be incumbent on Labour to be we organise the water industry, talking to unions, talking to the industry.
Are they not doing that already?
I don't think we're having those proper conversations at the moment. No, I don't.
Which is surprising, given that we're only, 5 or 6 months away from an election.
If I was the Labour Party, I think it's difficult. People are concerned about making any commitments around this is going to be hugely politically sensitive. It's not just about dirty beaches and rivers. There is going to be consequences in terms of people's bills. But I think it's about time that we had an honest conversation about what the role of the state is going to be in water and how we're going to organise the water sector in future.
Diana.
Well, I agree with everything that's just been said by Gary about regulation. I think Ofwat and actually other regulators in other sectors like Ofcom, I don't think have the powers.
Regulator.
Have Fantastic. The powers. Well, I've got a different experience in Hull with Ofcom. I'll tell you that.
Have you?
Yes. So, in terms of their regulation of telecommunications companies, but that's a different issue. I think there's a real question mark over the regulatory powers that these bodies have and whether we need to beef them up if Labour does get into government. I also think it's worth looking.
Can I think point out the phrase is if we have the honour.
If we have the honour, sorry, it's been a long day. If we have the honour. The other thing is about Scotland, because as I understand it in Scotland, the arrangements there around mutual ownership of the water companies, I think that's right.
That's correct, and there's a different system in Wales as well. Far from perfect, though, it has to be said. Sure. Far from perfect.
But worth looking at in terms of what I think Gary was saying about companies that have come in and asset stripped and ended up paying large amounts of money to shareholders and finding consumers having huge increases in their bills. So I just think it's worth looking at some of these other ways of how you deal with utilities.
Christian.
So I'll probably just make a couple of slightly controversial points, which are firstly, I heard in the Commons chamber a couple of weeks ago an SNP MP boasting about how sewage discharging in Scotland was so much lower or better than it is in England. And there's a wider point to be made here that the government has largely made this rod for their own back, because it is not necessarily, as far as I'm aware, the case that sewage overflows have massively increased. It's that they've put in so many more sensors and we are now much more aware of how bad the problem has been for a very long time. And Scotland has fewer operating sensors actually marking the overflow situation. So firstly, I think that's an important point to be made here about the wider context. The second thing I would say is I don't actually believe that however avaricious or selfish or greedy the executives at water companies are, they actively take personal delight in allowing sewage to flow into rivers and seas. The fundamental problem...
Well, that's all right then.
No, but hang on. The fundamental problem is that we are running a 21st century country of tens of millions of people on largely antiquated, outdated and unfit for purpose Victorian sewage works.
Sounds like the House of Commons.
Well, tell me about it. And that is the wider debate. This really can only stop until we put in the legwork and upgrade our water infrastructure.
But that was the argument for privatisation in the first place, wasn't it?
Well,
the Thatcher, or was it the Major government, I can't remember which, but they argued that the public sector was never going to be able to provide the investment, so the private sector then would step in. And for the first 10 years, that did happen. But it was when, as Gary says, companies like Macquarie came into it and effectively stripped a load of the assets out.
Yes, and I think that's where the regulator point comes in very well, because I think when these changes initially happen, either way, when you privatise an industry or bring it back into state control, there's a great deal of focus for an initial few years on making it work and justifying the new system. Either the government needs to prove that nationalisation worked, the private companies, vice versa, and then things become quite slack and they start nipping at the edges and taking money off the top and all the rest of it. But that is the major warning here, is if nationalisation is the answer, then that is then once again the state's problem, and that is a multi-billion pound issue to upgrade the sewage network in this country, and I don't think the government can afford it at the moment.
But this could be a big political win for Labour, couldn't it, Diana? And the Liberal Democrats seem to have made more of the running on this than Labour have so far.
Well, I think the Labour Party have been very clear that we want to ensure that the public services that we have actually operate and work properly, and obviously waters...
You're not talking to Gary about how to make that happen in the water industry.
I'm just a humble backbencher, so I wouldn't be in the room with Gary. I mean, he's obviously a very senior trade union official. He'd be meeting with my colleagues on the front bench.
Yeah, but he's not. Are you not?
I don't think there is the... Around utilities generally, but water in particular, this is going to come into focus very sharply in the next few months, particularly with the predicament in Thames Water. And we all have to take a responsibility of having a different conversation.
When was the last time you met a Labour frontbencher on this issue?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily do that, and it's not necessarily my job. We've got teams of people who deal with water. It wouldn't be my job specifically to do that.
I'm sure there's conversations going on. I'm sure there are.
Doesn't sound like it is to me, but anyway.
We've got a massive problem.
Are you seriously saying that you are not meeting yourself? You are the lead. You're the head of the trade union. That you're not meeting with Steve Reid, Labour Shadow DEFRA Secretary, to discuss this.
No, our national officials would be the people who would lead on that for us. For us as a union. I'm sure it would. But look, the other point about clean beaches and clean rivers, let's not forget a lot of this was driven by European legislation. Won't be popular necessarily with Christian, but that's what drove the clean-up. It wasn't privatisation, it wasn't incentives around private water companies, it was legislation for Europe. We have... and, you know, for those who defend the private sector in water, that's fine. What have you got to say about Macquarie's track record in Thames Water? Because people are going to pay through the nose to clean that mess up. And meanwhile, the infrastructure is falling apart.
I'm absolutely happy to accept that Thames Water has been a disaster, and I think we may... I don't want to presume your own opinion, but I would be furious, for example, if the Treasury came in and sort of rescued this in the sense that the people who have owned it, the people who have asset stripped and the people who've made money off the back of it for the last few years do not personally feel the financial impact of that, because I think it would be a disgrace to try and sort of cover this up to an extent that people don't feel the impact if that means bailing out the current owners.
And a sense that in a lot of these companies there's been fragmentation, they've broken up bits of the business. These businesses in many cases I think are dysfunctional. Get workers round the table, people in the industry and consumers, and let's have an honest debate about how we're going to get clean water and how we're going to deal with our sewage in the years ahead.
Tom, you're being uncharacteristically quiet on this.
Because he's responsible for that.
Because I think
he's a humble backbencher.
I think this debate's often, privatisation, nationalisation. Truth is, I think there's probably the best system's probably somewhere in between, with smarter regulation, but also harnessing some of the private sector investment, etc. There have been some, mistruths put out. I mean, a lot of my colleagues have been, particularly it's been Liberal Democrats actually, who have put out...
let's gang up on the Liberal Democrats.
Who have, again, made it seem that because we brought in legislation to try and deal with this, one could argue it didn't go far enough, amendments were made. But the idea that, MPs, we came into politics because we got some sort of sadistic joy out of putting sewerage in rivers is clearly absurd. So this is... But I actually do, I don't not sympathise with many of the points that you've made. I'm not, the system isn't working as it ought to be working. And I'm, certainly any conversation about how we can improve it, I want to, would like to be part of.
Right, it's 8:49.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
8:51 on LBC. Let's take a text question from Bill. Is the Labour Party still the party of workers, or is it now just a party for washed-up Tories? Can't think who you're talking about. Gary?
What I would say is symptomatic of the collapse of the Tory party that people from across the Tory spectrum are defecting to Labour.
Do you welcome them all?
No, I certainly wouldn't. But I'm not the leader of the Labour Party. It's not my decision. What I would say is that it is very, very important that working class people in this country have a voice. There's a lot of people who felt disaffected, not listened to, and have had no outlet in terms of their frustrations, the cost of living crisis, issues around insecurity at work. And I think it's really important that the party of Labour listens to the legitimate concerns of working class people, and that we shape an agenda around workers' rights and union rights, the New Deal for working people that Labour have got, which are a really positive programme, and that we also talk about an economy that's going to deliver for ordinary working people in this country, because there's too many people being left behind. And when working people don't feel they're listened to, and they don't have a voice and they don't have an outlet, that's when we see politics break into the right and into the politics of division and hate. So no, is the Labour Party still the party of workers? I would like it to be, and I would, we've many more members who are in the party, and it's certainly not just about washed-up Tories. Though I do get the point, it's one well made.
47% of so-called working class people voted Conservative at the last election. Now, I suspect that might change this time. But what lessons do you draw from that?
You've got to listen to working people. You've got to listen to working people. People at work feel as though they've had a raw deal. They feel that they've been cheated often in the workplace. Not everybody, but many people feel as though they're getting a raw deal at work. And then they're watching the cost of living go through the roof, the price of food, the price of heat in their homes, and they don't feel listened to. And that's why this breaks to the right. What unions are about, and the Labour Party should be about listening to these people and bringing them into the Labour Party.
Well, the Labour Party is the party of ordinary people, it seems to me, ordinary working people and ordinary people generally. And the policies that we're putting forward now around cost of living, housing, the NHS, these are all the kind of bread and butter issues that ordinary people feel they've had a raw deal about over the last 40 years. Who are these
ordinary people?
Well,
does anybody consider themselves ordinary?
Not the super rich, not in the billionaire class, not people who every month have to watch their budgets and make sure that, that they can do everything they need to do on wages that we know have been stagnant for a very long time. So, and also I worry a bit when we talk about just working people, because there are lots of people in our community who are not in work, either because they're retired or because they've got a disability, or they're bringing up children, or they're caring for relatives or loved ones. And they also have an important part to play in our political system. So absolutely right, working people, important, but we have everyone else as well. And that's
including washed-up Tories.
And we have some washed-up Tories, and that says something, as Gary was saying, about the state of the governing party in this country, that they're all either deciding they're not going to stand again or they're leaving in their droves. So it's kind of interesting.
It's only 3.
Well, that's quite good. I remember back, was it before 97? We had quite a few then, didn't we, who came over to Labour? Yeah. It's obviously the end of an era, it seems to me.
I mean, I think, I guess it's, what do we mean by working people? Do we mean the traditional sense of working class? I mean, what I would say is it's, clearly a key issue here is, the economy, cost of living, etc., workers' rights. But part of it is also values. And I think that does matter. And I do think with many people I speak to who, in my constituency, who would deem themselves to be working class, they do believe that there's been a distance between them and the modern-day Labour Party, and some of it is to do with values. It's to do with the Labour Party they perceive as not being in the right place on things like immigration, law and order, patriotism, etc. And I think it's interesting that in the last local elections in Ipswich, we didn't do particularly well, unsurprisingly. But there's this one ward where I put in quite a lot of effort, and we lost it by sort of 140 votes. And I thought, this is really disappointing. And a councillor who'd been a councillor for like 30 years sent me a result from 96, and we'd lost it by 900 votes. So it was interesting that even now, in a context where we're sort of 20 points
crumbs of comfort that you managed to find.
So I think there has. I mean, I do believe that some of it's to do with Brexit. I do believe there's been a bit of a realignment, not just in our politics, but politics across the world. And I think this, and I do think there's something in that. And I do think lots of, old Labour, Jim Callaghan, used to be pretty sound on immigration, for example, right? That kind of communitarian strand of the Labour Party, which was sort of quite socially conservative, but on the economy, quite socialist. I mean, there aren't that many Labour MPs like that still around. So I do think there's a point to this. And washed-up Tories, well, I'm glad you have such a high opinion of your new colleagues, but I couldn't possibly comment.
Christian.
Well, I tell you what, let me be nice to Keir Starmer for a minute, which is to say that I'm
afraid that's all we've got time for.
So yeah, I'm sacked. I'm much happier that the main opposition in this country is now a home for washed-up Tories rather than what it housed, for quite a long time under its previous leader, that was altogether much more distasteful, much more damaging and threatening to this country's prospect. So I'd much rather a party of ex-Tory MPs than of, whatever rubbish Jeremy Corbyn attracted. But it was a very very, very odd decision, and I think it's right to question, at what point does a tent become so large it can no longer support its own weight? And it further begs questions about what Keir Starmer and the modern Labour Party actually stand for in terms of values.
In terms of defence, in terms of energy security, in terms of social division in this country, the Tories have left this country in an absolute mess. It's outrageous for you to be talking about patriotism and the good of the country. Look at the state of the Navy. Look at the state of our military. We are spending more on energy imports than we do on defence and education. It happened in your party's watch, Tom.
We've made a commitment on defence spending that hasn't yet been.
You can provide one plane to send veterans to the D-Day commemorations. One plane. I mean, it's disgraceful, isn't it?
Yeah.
We couldn't build nuclear submarines under the Tory government with Cameron. This is the problems we had at places like Barrow and Furness.
But in terms of
our Navy's in dry dock, or it's having to be completely rebuilt.
Okay, quickly, Tom.
It's just, is the Labour Party going to match our commitment on 2.5% of defence spending by 2030? Is it not?
How long have you been in power?
Because I'd probably take Labour Party more seriously if it did meet that commitment, and it hasn't.
Okay. Right, time for our fun question, which is from Danny in Leeds. The AI platform ChatGPT is removing one of the computer-generated voices it uses because it sounds too much like the Hollywood actress Scarlett Johansson. If you could pick one celebrity's voice who you'd want to be the voice of AI in the future, whose would it be and why, Gary Smith?
I am bored with the celebrity culture. I wouldn't be a celebrity. I'd have my wee ma. At least I'd be able to understand it. Some of it would have to be deleted out with the language that she uses, but it would be my wee mother. She'll be listening tonight as well.
Hello, Mum. Christian.
Well, I tell you, I'll pick Boris Johnson. I think it would brighten my day. It would make me laugh, but it would remind you to take AI with a large pinch of salt in its veracity.
Remind you to vote.
Oof, cutting. Tom.
Probably Trump, just because it would annoy all the right people.
Diana?
And I quite fancy the Speaker, actually.
Do you?
Speaker
That's a revelation.
Yeah, to do this.
For his voice,
to do this,
I see.
Yeah. I think he's got quite a distinctive Chorley accent, hasn't he? Yeah.
Chorley.
Yeah.
Chorley.
Yeah.
Lindsay Oil.
Lindsay Oil.
Yeah. I like Lindsay. That's a great.
Well, I'm so disappointed that none of you have said me. And I'm not a celebrity, so there we go. Thank you all for coming on the programme tonight. Dame Diana Johnson, Christian Calgie, Gary Smith and Tom Hunt. On the programme tomorrow, we have the Green Party MP Caroline Lucas, the social justice campaigner, the Reverend Stephen Chalk, the former Scottish First Minister Alex Salmond, and the Conservative MP Heather Wheeler. So do make sure you tune in for that. Coming up in the next hour, we're going to talk about the other really big big news story of the day. The chief prosecutor from the International Criminal Court has applied for arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and the Hamas leaders in Gaza, Yahya Sinwar, for war crimes. I wonder what good this is going to do, in the sense that it's not going to do anything to bring an end to the fighting in Gaza, is it? So what is the point? And is it really